we are now ready to go. And so it's good to be back with you today. Let me jump right in, and I'll just start by noting two things very quickly. The first is that we are seeing some evidence of increased transmission of the Omicron B variant of the coronavirus. Please be careful. I'm not sure. I think you need to consult with physicians to figure out whether it makes sense to get the second booster now. But clearly, it still is important to be masking and distancing and trying to protect yourself, calculating your risk budget, figuring out which risks to take and which to avoid. Unfortunately, we are, of course, all exhausted with this, but that does not mean the virus is exhausted or through with us. And so we have to be careful. Second thing, last week we spoke together for almost the entire lecture about the Supreme Court, about the historic nature of, now we get to say, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's nomination and now confirmation. And I just wanted to add one other thing. It kind of belatedly dawned on me with the most obvious thing, which is I emphasized last week that she is very unlikely to change jurisprudence, unlikely to change decisions on some of the really contentious issues in front of the court, issues in which it appears the majority of Americans are on one side and the court is on another side, and the court is going to prevail over the majority of Americans' views, and that many of us have trouble seeing this as a principled constitutional argument, much more as a kind of partisanship that has now colonized the judiciary, and that is undermining the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and may therefore lead us to consider and perhaps even to gain some momentum on the idea of Supreme Court reform. I think I left one thing out, which is that for the whole history of the court has been, I shouldn't say for the whole history, but for the vast majority of the history of the court, 9 white men in robes, right? A while back, it was fewer than that, but it was always exclusively white men until quite recently. And for the first time in the history of the court, we now have an African-American woman on the court. We now have a Latino woman on the court. We have a court that looks more like America. And I don't know how much easier that makes it to take the decisions that seem to be hostile to what many Americans believe, but I assume it can't hurt and that it may in fact help. And so I think that's just one more little thread left over from last week I wanted to touch on. This week I want to, yes, go ahead.
Isn't it also true, I heard it, I'm not absolutely sure of this, but isn't it true that now at last we have a Protestant on the court?
Yeah, I guess that's right also, right? That it's been Catholics and Jews up until now. I don't know how much attention people pay to that aspect of it. So one of the things I guess I'm talking about is the facial optics of the court, right? Basically with the Supreme Court, because they're wearing black robes, all you see is the faces, unless it's Ginsburg, and then maybe you see a white collar. But the idea that we don't necessarily see their religion, even if their religion is in a sense not particularly representative, I don't know how much that matters to the.
Well, it certainly mattered a lot when the first Catholic was appointed, and when the first Jew was appointed. It was a great big story. Mm-hmm. So the Protestants around, of which I sort of am one, should get a little mention here, I think.
Good. Okay. Fair enough, John. Thank you. Anything else in terms of those themes from last week? Then let me get into this week's big theme. And the big theme I want to talk about this week is what I'm going to call energy transition. And I believe that two things that are in the news this week should lead us to focus on the need to transition away from a carbon-based energy system, and at the same time, the difficulties of doing that. And one of them is the increasing visibility of the atrocities being committed in the Ukraine by the Russians, and the increased outrage this is producing in much of the rest of the world, and the growing desire then to make our sanctions commensurate with our disgust and the degree to which we want to make it absolutely clear to Putin and his regime, this is intolerable, right? And yet, and here is, I think, the irony that we're not talking enough about. The European Union is transferring to Putin around 600 million euros a day for petroleum purchases, right? And so on the one hand, let's get tough on Putin, let's slap all these sanctions, and on the other hand, oh, by the way, here's the money that allows you to evade the worst impacts of these sanctions, to soften the blow, to protect your regime, to protect your population from really feeling the force of our ire and disgust, right? And so clear hypocrisy, or perhaps, if you want to be softer, a paradox here, which is the Europeans want to punish Putin, but the Europeans need his oil. There's a lyric, I want to do right, but not right now. The idea that Germany said, yes, absolutely, let's embargo Russian coal, but let's wait 4 months, because that's the amount of time we need to adjust our economy. And you do understand, you know, Marie Le Pen, who's running quite tight against Macron in France in the upcoming election, is saying it out loud. Why should the French working class have to suffer to protect the Ukrainians? Right? The straightforward right-wing populist ethno-nationalism says we're not going to sacrifice our interests for some distant country that we didn't even really care about until the Russians invaded. By the way, we're not quite as critical of Putin as the rest of you are, but framing it that way, right, makes it absolutely clear that there are trade-offs here, and they're hard trade-offs, and this represents then Europe's dependence on Russia's natural gas, oil, and coal. And so if Europe were to make an energy transition, if it were to move away from a carbon-based energy system, it would be in the position to more effectively sanction Putin. Second element of this, and I've abbreviated it in the title. I think many of you are familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN sanctioned scientific body that gives us periodic updates on a variety of issues to do with climate change. The final volume of the final IPCC report, we'll have to see. They were under their mandate asked to do 6 reports. Perhaps there will be more reports, because although we've had 6 reports over a long period now, over 20 years, it's not entirely clear, I should say it is entirely clear, that we haven't done what the reports recommend us to take the steps that they recommend us to take, right? And so, will there be another IPCC report? I don't know. But 2 reports were issued in the last 5 weeks, one at the end of February, one at the beginning of April. And because in the first instance, Russia had just launched its invasion of the Ukraine, because in the second instance, the atrocities that were emerging in the suburbs of Kyiv, the evidence of the atrocities that was finally coming to light as the Russians withdrew, that has distracted us from this report. And I think this report deserves our attention as well. And so I want to spend roughly half of the lecture today talking about the report, its findings, and its mixed evidence about where we're headed and how we would need to change course. And clearly, what the report is saying is that we need an energy transition. We need to move away from a carbon-based and into a sustainable energy system, that the technology is there. The will so far is lacking, but it is long past time. We are running out of time to avert the worst consequences of climate change. We need to be doing this decade. And this decade is a quarter over. So that means we need to be doing this year, next year. And I need to spend a little bit of time going through some of these findings with you to explain where the sense of urgency, almost panic, is coming from, but also, frankly, where some of the cautious optimism is coming about our capacity to mark this transition if we are willing to do the hard work. So let's start with the Ukraine. And as you are probably aware, because you're following the news like I am, the big development in the last week since we last spoke is the withdrawal of Russian troops from the northeast of Ukraine. As you can see in the small overall map of the Ukraine, Kyiv sits roughly in the center in terms of the east-west dimension of the Ukraine, and more or less in the north, very close to Belarus. And we know the Russians, when they launched their invasion, opened up nearly 1,000-mile front, stretching from Kyiv through Kharkiv, through the Donbass, and then circling back around to Mariupol and stretching in the direction of Odessa. And it appears the strategy here, some people have compared it to the German blitzkrieg strategy in a country like Poland, that the military force would be so overwhelming that the resistance and ultimately the regime would crumble in its face. Others, I think, perhaps more insightfully, are comparing it with the Soviet interventions in Hungary and Poland, I'm sorry, Hungary and Czechoslovakia in the 50s and the 60s. And again, a similar kind of overwhelming display of force leads the opposition to stand down. And the thought apparently was that they could sustain a front of this length because the victory would come so quickly. And of course, nothing like that happened. The Ukrainians have fought heroically and successfully, used guerrilla tactics and new technology to stymie the invasion. And so the Russians are regrouping. They are rededicating their resources. It does appear that they are getting ready to mount a much more confined attack. As you can see, the area of detail, which used to be really half of Ukraine, has shrunk to around a quarter of the Ukraine, and in particular focusing on the Donbass region, especially the Luhansk and Donetsk provinces, or the areas where there are already Russian-sponsored hot wars going on. And of course, the siege of Mariupol has continued. And so I think we should be prepared for this to be a protracted war, that the Ukrainians seem to have the will to fight. The Russians certainly do not seem to be pursuing an exit strategy, but it will be a more confined war. And let us hope. We saw the terrible bombing at the train station yesterday, killing and maiming many children. The Russians, I think, clearly knew what they were doing in targeting the train station as people were trying to evacuate the region. We've seen the Russians moving thousands, maybe tens or even hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians into Russian territory. I think the initial take on this is that they were hostages, that essentially the Russians were going to try to use their Ukrainian prisoners that they had taken to Russia as bargaining chips in order to produce the results that they had been unable to produce militarily. It now appears that they're also part of a stagecraft campaign, that they're trying to convince the Russian public that it's the Ukrainians who are fleeing the Ukraine because of the barbarism of the Ukrainian regime, that they're Nazis, etc. And so this is what's circulating on Russian media right now, is we are sheltering the Ukrainians from their own regime. There's awful stuff that is happening right now and that we should anticipate continuing. It is clearly a victory for the Ukrainians that the theater of conflict is now this much narrower, much more confined theater. It doesn't mean that the suffering is over. The awfulness of warfare in general, and in particular, the kind of warfare that the Russians are waging with high-tech weapons trained indiscriminately on civilian populations, with the growing evidence, and I'll move to the second point now, that as the Russians occupied the territories north and east and west of the capital, the suburbs essentially of Kyiv, they committed massive atrocities, that they mowed civilians down in their lawns, in their backyards, that they executed their captives. And we don't have all the documentation yet. There will need to be tribunals and investigations, but it certainly appears that war crimes were committed by the Russians. The satellite evidence, the intercepted communications that the Germans are now sharing, the evidence in front of our eyes of these awful images is highly persuasive. As upsetting, of course, as it is persuasive, I'm not going to share those images with you today. They are truly awful. But having said that, this has, among other things, spurred much of the Western world to try to amplify the sanctions already being imposed on Russia. And I'll just note very briefly, it appears the Russians may have defaulted on a bond repayment, a bond that was demarcated in dollars. They paid in rubles, and it'll be up to the rating agencies whether that's a default, but it looks like it's a default, and that will cost the Russian economy a great deal in the long term, in terms of interest rates, in terms of their credit worthiness. It is the case that the Europeans are going to ban Russian coal 4 months from now, but it remains the case. And this is why I want to say these sanctions are punishing but limited. Limited because the Europeans cannot wean themselves of Russian carbon products quickly enough. It'll probably be at least 2 years before they can really find a substitute for Russian natural gas, a similar amount of time before they can find a substitute for Russian oil. And so for the next couple of years, they will continue to fund Vladimir Putin's regime, even as they try to sanction.
Yeah, did you have a chance to talk to Todd?
So I just muted everyone. I'm sure you guys heard there was a little bit of background noise. You can unmute yourself whenever you want to, just by pushing your space bar or hitting that microphone icon. So this is an opportunity to continue just for a moment a conversation we began last week about the efficacy of sanctions, right? And so I'm noting on the one hand that the Europeans are stuck in a dilemma. They are taking with one hand and giving with the other, trying to punish the Russian economy, but still consuming large amounts of Russian oil, and as a result, transferring large amounts of precious foreign currency that is being used to cushion the Russian economy from the worst effects of the sanctions. And so let's talk just for a moment about the sanctions. And I made the case to you last week that the sanctions fall primarily on the groups in Russia least responsible for the conduct of the regime, on the working class, on the poor, on the middle class, that yes, the oligarchs are suffering. They're losing their $100 million yachts, and their private airplanes can't fly anymore to Monaco or wherever their luxury vacation homes are if they're outside of Russia. But the oligarchs, the people close to the regime, are not going to go hungry. They're not going to have trouble paying their rent. They're not going to have trouble getting their medicine. That is really the ordinary Russians who these sanctions hit hardest. Last week, I spoke with you about this as economic warfare, and in a sense, indiscriminate economic warfare. And the fact that the violence that this kind of warfare does is slow and diffuse. We don't see bombs going off and train stations being destroyed, doesn't make it any less harmful. It's hard to get an accurate count on the number of children that were killed by American sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, but conservative estimates suggest that we should number it in the hundreds of thousands, right? And so real harm is done to innocents by sanctions. These sanctions appear to have little to no chance of changing the regime's conduct. Why are we imposing them? Well, in part because we need some way to express our outrage. And these are then symbolic or expressive, as opposed to efficacious policy options. And I do think there is something to be said for saying as loudly and clearly in ways that make life as hard as possible for Vladimir Putin, we won't tolerate this. By the way, some of the sanctions, like not allowing the Russians to get the microchips that they use in their guided missiles, those are efficacious. But the broad-based economic sanctions are not going to stifle the capacity of the Russian regime to wage war or convince Putin, I don't believe, to cease and desist his efforts. So one reason to do it is to express our condemnation in the clearest, most forceful means we have, absent actual military intervention in a theater where we would risk escalation with a nuclear armed power. And so it seems the best option we have if we feel like we have to do something. The other thing I would say, and again, I've been doing some more reading and this came up, if this appears to be successful, not just to Putin, but to those observing in other autocratic regimes or potentially aggressive regimes in the world, if ultimately the cost is not too high for Russia, then other potential aggressors may draw the lesson. We can do this too. We can get away with this too. The rhetoric of war crimes and international order is not sufficient to deter. And so sanctions are necessary to convince other would-be aggressors that this level of violence will not be tolerated. And if you're thinking about this, and here we can point to the Saudis or the Iranians or the North Koreans, if you're thinking about this, recognize that the costs are going to be extraordinarily high. And so that's a second reason to think that we should have effective sanctions on Russia. I don't know how to balance these considerations. I suggested to you last week that we should be thinking about creating carrots, creating incentives, indicating to Putin which of the sanctions will be lifted when he ceases aggression in the Ukraine, how quickly they would be removed, trying to indicate to him that this is not permanent economic warfare of the West against Russia if he is willing to reach some sort of accord with Zelensky and the Ukraine. All right, that's really all I wanted to say today about Russia and the Ukraine. Let me just pause for a moment and ask, is there anything you want to discuss about what's happening in the Ukraine? I do want to transition to talking about climate change and the new reports that are out. All right, so as always, feel free to unmute yourself and comment at any point you want, but let me move to the second topic, which I'm unifying under the idea of energy transitions. And this is, I think, the key finding from the most recent volume of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And as you can see, right, going back to 1990, we have continued, or in fact, perhaps even escalated the rate of increase of greenhouse gases. I know this is something you're all familiar with. I think you can think here of what happens when you leave your car outside in a parking lot in the sun with the windows rolled up. These gases, they're increased, they're the equivalent of rolling up the windows on the Earth's atmosphere. Just as your car traps the sun's heat, it comes in through the windows and then can't get out. And so inside the car, it is hotter than it is outside the car. The sun's heat and energy is trapped by these gases. And over the last 150 years, we have dramatically increased the concentration of these gases in our atmosphere. And over the last 30, 40, 50 years, you know, we can debate when we first really came to clarity about what the consequences of what we were doing would be. But even as we become more and more convinced, and when I say we, the scientific world, but increasingly the publics of much of the rest of the world, that this is a path to vast catastrophe on a planetary scale, we have not changed course. And so then let me bring in the general rubric of energy transition, and note that energy transitions are hard and slow and up until this point of a different kind than the kind we need today. And so very quickly, I've been looking at the literature on this, and I'll just ask for a second. What's the first source of energy that human beings mastered in our energy economy? Anybody got a thought? Okay, I won't play the guessing game for too long. Food. And so even as we domesticated animals and started to use domesticated animals to do our labor for us, we were feeding them, right? And so this is called an endosomatic energy regime, a regime in which the energy consumption occurs primarily inside bodies, our own or those of the animals we have tamed. That's the first transition is away from that regime and into a regime in which we burn wood. And that occurs in the Neolithic, and we can see the signs in the archaeological record. This essentially allows human civilization to begin to take shape. And by the way, it also allows us to eat less food because we don't have to produce as much energy to heat our bodies because we're burning wood to heat our homes. That's thousands of years ago, right? The second big transition occurs at the beginning of the 18th century. And that's when it's discovered that coal is more efficient than wood, especially in some proto-industrial processes like smelting iron. And so we begin to replace or supplement wood with coal. And that transition lasts about 200 years. It's really not until the early 20th century that human beings are getting more energy from coal than wood. And of course, it's around that time that we discover that we can extract oil and use oil for, among other things, internal combustion engines. And that starts the next big transition. And again, to give you a sense of how this works, it's not until the early 1960s that oil becomes more important than coal as a source of energy for the overall energy system on which humans rely. And so I just want you to have that in mind as then we look at this diagram. If what we're seeing here is evidence that we are still in the carbon-based energy system, oil and coal, and you can see CO2 from fossil fuel is the largest portion of the greenhouse gases being emitted these days. The second largest is the methane, primarily from farming. Up there also is CO2 from land use, especially from slash and burn farming. And then there are some other greenhouse gases, right? But what we have failed to do so far is to contain the growth of our reliance on carbon-based energy. That's, I think, the fundamental takeaway from this report, despite the knowledge that continuing down this path puts us on an irresistible path to disaster. I've shared this with you before, and I don't need to dwell on it very much today. The energy that comes from the sun into the Earth's atmosphere, a large portion of it goes into the land or the oceans that cover the surface of the Earth. A smaller portion goes into the atmosphere. Before 1850, about 3/5 of the energy was ultimately being absorbed by the planet, whereas about 2/5 was being radiated back out into the solar system. And please note that that puts us in the Goldilocks zone, right? The right amount of the sun's energy being retained for biological life and human civilization to flourish on Earth. But after 1850, we start increasing the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Their concentration in terms of parts per million goes up dramatically, and so too then does the absorptive capacity of the atmosphere, the way in which it traps the heat's energy. And so now we get to the point where roughly 4/5 instead of 3/5 of that energy is being trapped. Now, one of the things to note about, and let me see here for a moment, I'll go here first, this report has incorporated the new findings that came out after the Paris Accords. Paris Accords set the objective for a global goal of containing global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. The new report sets that goal at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you can see that line here. And the reason the Intergovernmental Panel changed the goal from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees is reflected in this diagram, which is the greater knowledge we have of various feedback loops, right? And so the issue here is, as the temperature on the planet rises, processes that are caused by the hotter temperatures, right? So we burn fossil fuel, they end up in the atmosphere, the temperatures rise, sea level temperature rise, and then a whole bunch of dominoes start to fall as we get above 1.5 degrees. We are at about 1.1 degrees now. And by the way, what this diagram shows is that even on the very best case scenario, the UN no longer thinks we will be able to stay under 1.5 degrees. The best case scenario is an overshoot in the middle of the century that gets us above 1.5. But if we then rapidly decarbonize our economy, actually decarbonize our economy now in the 2020s, by the time we get to the 2070s, the 2080s, the temperature change will begin to drop back down as the concentration in the atmosphere of some of these gases diminishes over time. And then we will be back into the safe zone, right? The unsafe zone, the zone that's over 1.5 degrees, as the temperatures rise, the sea level rises, we get things like Arctic sea ice cap melt, right? And in general, the melting of the large amount of ice in the two polar caps in Greenland, in Iceland, in other places, where essentially we have big reflectors taking up a large portion of the Earth's surface, because of course, ice is white. White is the most reflective color. As that ice melts, it's replaced with green and brown, the color of water and earth and plants, much more absorptive. And so even if we manage to get the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases back down, if we've melted the ice caps, we may have locked in a self-reinforcing cycle of heating. And so getting it to maximum of 1.5 degrees, the thinking is the best way to keep some of these independent self-reinforcing processes, where after we've gone over 1.5 degrees, we can get all of the carbon out of the air, and it's still going to perhaps be runaway global climate change. And so the sobering conclusion of the report is that the majority of scenarios have us going over 1.5 degrees. Even the most optimistic scenario has us going over 1.5, but just ever so slightly for maybe 50 years. The way to express this, I think the clearest way to express this is that if we keep global warming to less than 1.5 degrees, we have, the Intergovernmental Panel tells us, a 50% chance of avoiding global catastrophe. And I think that's right sobering. One way to express that metaphorically is that's like playing Russian roulette in a 2-chamber gun with 1 bullet in one of those chambers. But if we are on these tracks, which right is in a sense where we are right now, we're not playing Russian roulette. We are committing suicide. And the alarm that the report sounds is reflected in, and I'm sorry, the graphics the UN uses, I think, are awful. They're trying to get a lot of information into a single diagram. I'm not going to go through all the details of this with you. We can talk. I do want to do a series of lectures with you on climate change, maybe even later this month. But for now, let's just get an overview, right? And as you can see here, the confidence in the idea that there's going to be destruction with the blue dots is very high, right? High to very high. And so global destruction in ecosystems, if we stay on the course right now, is going to be very high. And that's true basically for every continent with the possible exception of Antarctica. And then this diagram begins to unpack continent by continent, small island nations, North America, Europe, Central and South America, etc., the kinds of particular disasters that will occur if we stay on the course we're on. river ecosystems, ocean ecosystems, forests, rainforests, savannas are all going to be disrupted. Migratory patterns are going to be disrupted. The food supply of animals will be disrupted if the spring arrives earlier. And migratory birds that feed on insects that hatch in the spring arrive after the spring has arrived because they're evolved with the old patterns in our seasons. They die out. They do not have what they need to eat. And then, of course, there's the human impact, and some of this will have to do with emotions. There seems to be a very strong correlation between increased temperatures and increased incidences of anger, aggression, and violence, right? And so the world will become a more fractious place as it heats up. But in addition to that, illness, right? The range of mosquitoes that bear some of the truly awful diseases will continue to spread. And so ultimately, we're talking about vast damage to both ecosystems and human civilizations if we stay on the path we are on. And the evidence is accumulating that this is already happening. This is the Larsen-B ice shelf in Antarctica. Some people refer to this ice shelf as a doomsday ice shelf. The metaphor here is essentially like a cork in a champagne bottle. Certain ice shelves keep in place large ice fields and glaciers, keep them protected from the ocean water, keep them sitting where they're sitting. If those ice shelves collapse, then the glaciers begin to be exposed to warmer ocean water, begin to move towards the ocean, eventually to calve, as they say, to fall into the ocean, and then to melt still more rapidly. There's worry that this ice shelf by itself melting could raise sea levels globally by 4 to 8 meters. And if you think about what that does to San Francisco, what that does to Manhattan, to Brooklyn, to Miami, what it does to low-lying island nations, or the vast majority of large human cities that are built in coastal or port areas. This is a disaster that is unfolding slowly but inexorably in front of us. The area that has collapsed here is roughly the size of Philadelphia, 32 square kilometers. It's about a third of the ice shelf. And now the question is, as the ocean can move further in, does it further destabilize the remaining ice shelf? And that, of course, in addition to contributing to global sea level rise, decreases the salinity of the ocean, could interfere with the ocean's conveyor belt that transmits warm equatorial water to the poles and cold polar water to the middle of the planet, moderating the temperature of the whole planet. It's potentially endangering the ecosystem of the Georgia Sea Islands, which have some unique species of penguins, etc. There's a lot of damage. A lot of, I like the metaphor of dominoes. One thing falls and it just keeps going. And so this is why the scientists, the 10,000 scientists whose work is organized under the IPCC, are really, I think, trying to say as loudly and clearly as possible, act now before it's too late, because we are already seeing the kinds of degradation that will become more and more common and will ultimately put the planet and human civilization in jeopardy if we don't do something, right? The report also contains good news. And to put it in its simplest terms, the good news is that it is not too late. We could still get to that scenario where we overshoot a little, but not a lot. And then let us hope that we can do things like what some scientists are recommending, which is put ships in the Arctic and Antarctic to spray seawater in the cold months back onto the glaciers and the ice sheets to artificially help them rebuild their lost and decayed structure, and so to, in a sense, reverse the effects of climate change. We also get good news in the sense that the technology needed to do this is increasingly available to us, right? And so this diagram, which again synthesizes a great deal of information and sacrifices some clarity in order to get all of that information on a single diagram, shows us in the energy sector that with wind energy and solar energy really coming online on scale. And you may have seen the news that the United States, for the first time in its history in March, had wind energy as its #1 source of electricity generation, right? And the winds were high, the weather cooperated, but it's also the case that we have built a sufficient number of turbines that we can now really generate a substantial portion. Maybe it's only a quarter, but at least it's now the largest single source of our energy in a month, and that will continue to grow. Similarly, the IPCC believes that solar energy is even more promising over the next decade. Then there are things we can do in agriculture, including especially carbon sequestration, capture the carbon dioxide that's released from growing, fertilizing, transporting our agriculture, reduced conversion of forests, so less clear-cut farming, and then ecosystem restoration. All of these things could be substantial contributors. And then as we go down this list, I'm not going to go into the details, but changing the way we build, for instance, using heat pumps, which are much more efficient in terms of their electrical use, using public transportations and electrical vehicles that are more fuel efficient in industry as well as other places. The technology is there to finally have an accelerated energy transition to decarbonize the energy system of the world. So there is good news and bad news in this report. Again, just looking at some of the details, the good news is the price of solar cells has dropped substantially, right? The price of onshore wind has dropped modestly. Offshore wind, a little bit more volatile. Concentrating solar power dropped substantially, right? As well as the cost of batteries for electrical vehicles. And the result is that, at least in many of these sectors, the adoption has gone way up. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is seen in the contrast between this diagram and that first diagram I showed you, right? Which shows you that despite all of those gains in sustainable sources of energy, we continue to use larger and larger amounts of energy sources that generate the greenhouse gases that produce climate change. And so it's not enough to have alternative sources come online. We have to change the way we live. And that has to happen quickly. We have to change the food we eat, and the dietary shift here has to be to plant-based diets. It doesn't mean that we need to eliminate beef entirely, but in doing this research, I learned that for most of human history, most human beings either never ate beef or ate beef very rarely, a few times a year on special occasions. And that now the average American eats beef more than once a day, right? And so the rest of the world, right? The population of the world, of course, was 750 million in 1850, and it's now over 7.5 billion, right? We've increased the population 10 times. We cannot sustain the kind of life we have in the United States right now with that population of the world, right? And so we have to change what we eat. We have to change where what we eat comes from. We have to eat food that is more local. We have to change what we purchase. We have to demand that the goods that we purchase are made sustainably. We have to change our sources of energy. We have to change our entire way of life. And the simple way I would put this, I'm going to go here first. And again, I've been doing a fair bit of research as I get ready to do a more sustained lecture series on this. The energy intensiveness of our civilization, of the civilization we've built over the last, especially 500 years, especially 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, has meant that each previous energy transition has been additive, right? We have added coal, but still use wood. We add oil, but still use coal. Now we're adding solar and wind power, but still using every bit as much or more of the oil. And so the first time in human history, we have to have a different kind of energy transition, an energy transition that doesn't just involve adding a new source, but eliminating the old source, replacing it completely and entirely. And that's where I want to focus for a moment on the politics. And this is an old diagram, something you may remember me talking with you an awful lot about 6 months ago. Right, the Build Back Better plan. Remember them when that was the heart of Biden's agenda. And since then, our attention has been taken up by what's happening in the Ukraine, or by the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice, or by the findings of the January 6th inquiry. There's an awful lot to pay attention to, but we have to have the bandwidth. We have to have the sustained attention to also recognize that the clock is ticking down on climate change. The Build Back Better bill had items in it to subsidize the new kinds of power we need, to provide incentives for Americans to change their transportation, and perhaps most importantly, to finance research and development into carbon capture technology so we can begin to use less carbon in our productive processes, or at least to release less CO2 as we generate our electricity, drive our cars, etc. And so this is where we need to be going. This is what we need the political will to do. This is not going to be easy. This is going to involve a fairly fundamental transformation in the way in which we live. And yet it is absolutely essential that we begin doing this now. With everything else going on in the world, we cannot take our eyes off of this. We will deeply regret the failure to pay attention in 2022 to what we need to be doing to accelerate the energy transition, to accelerate removing carbon from our energy system, figuring out how to capture it, because failure to do it now means that the world will be less habitable a decade from now. I'll stop there. Happy to hear your thoughts, your questions. I hope the energy transition framework makes sense in terms of both why Europe really can't effectively sanction Russia right now, and why we are failing to do what the scientific evidence is absolutely clear we need to be doing to protect ourselves. Who wants to start us out with a question or an idea? Is this so bad you end up wishing you went to a memorial service instead of listening to me? Nobody today?
David, this is Bob.
Hi, Bob.
I just read recently, in fact, this morning, I think, about what the crisis in Ukraine is doing to this. Among other things, everybody is saying, well, let's reduce our reliance on Russian oil. But the problem is what they're doing is moving backwards to relying on coal again, and other things that are absolutely terrible for this process that we're trying to do. Do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, of course. And so the language that's being used sometimes on the right, especially, is energy sovereignty, right? And so let's only use energy sources that we can control. And in this country in particular, there's been a movement to revive fracking, to try to revive some of the pipelines that have been protested and blocked for decades now, right? I think I mentioned, right, Marie Le Pen is campaigning in France, may in fact win and become the new leader of France, right? A right-wing populist ethno-nationalist on the idea that the French working class shouldn't have to sacrifice to protect the Ukrainians, that effective leadership in France means prioritizing the French working class over the Ukrainians, right? And so there's a lot of, if you will, energy nationalism and energy populism circulating right now. And among the ideas is, let's just go cheap, right? Coal is cheap. It's why India and China rely so much on coal. And let's just go with the resources we control. It's why fracking and shale oil are so popular in the United States. One of the things I learned doing this research, especially Daniel Yergin's new map, really emphasizes that the United States emerged over the last 20 years thanks to the fracking and shale oil extraction technology revolution as one of the largest oil producers in the world. And so, yes, there's a whole entrenched industry here, right? The petrochemical industry, and there's a whole civilization built in reliance on that industry. It's going to be really, really hard to wean ourselves of this. I do think that the Europeans, and we'll have to see what happens in the French election, that might be kind of a bellwether for figuring this out. But I've said it before, the silver lining, if there is one, of Putin's invasion might be that the Europeans really accelerate into the transition away from a carbon-based energy system in order to not have to rely on Putin, but also in order to do what is necessary to save the planet. And by the way, if Europe, perhaps we put the European Union in one big category, the largest economy in the world, really accelerates into this transition, it has the effect of, no doubt, making it less expensive for the rest of the world, driving the efficiency of these technologies, driving technological breakthroughs. And so, Bob, I understand what you're saying. I'm seeing the same stuff. There is a kind of reactionary momentum behind the idea of energy sovereignty. But I think that there are also reasons to be cautiously hopeful that maybe Europe really will double down on wind and solar and begin using some of the tidal energy systems that they've been pioneering, maybe even some geothermal, maybe even return to nuclear, right? When you look at the details of the UN report, they're saying there are a whole bunch of options out there which are alternatives and viable today. We just have to make the investment to change our economy, our energy system. Does that help, Bob?
Yeah, I certainly understand what you're saying. Another point, however, well, not however, is that we're not taking proper advantage of the pandemic. During the pandemic, everybody got locked down, everybody stayed home, everybody worked from home, and now everybody's trying to get back in their cars and drive to work and all that sort of jazz. If we should go back into a lockdown and keep progressing with this working from home, electronic digital society.
Yeah, it's interesting. April, May of 2020 saw the most rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of any period in recent history, right? Probably any period ever. And that was directly related to the pandemic. People stopped driving, people stopped flying, people stopped traveling. And it's worthwhile noting that 6 months later, we hit a new record for the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so two things about that. The first is, right, some of this is just kind of built in. It's really hard to stop using electricity, right? And the people who are working from home are still using computers. How are we talking to each other right now, right? They're still using energy intensive technology. That energy has to come from somewhere, right? And most of it is generated in ways that put carbon into the atmosphere. So that's the first side of this. The second side of this is, yes, I mean, one of the things I'm looking at right now is how cities need to be rebuilt and built so that they have higher capacity for population, that more and more of us need to move back out of the suburbs and into the cities, but also built so that people can basically get everything they need, whether it is work, whether it is food, whether it is leisure or recreation, within walking distance of where they live, or at worst, a bicycle ride away, right? And we need to build better public transportation. So yes, it's one thing to say we haven't taken full advantage of the pandemic, but I think it's another thing to say we need a rather different infrastructure to our living to really be able to wean ourselves of carbon-based energy. Anybody else with a comment for today? All right, everyone. Take care. Good being with you. And I will see you again next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.